warm welcome to everyone. I'm Larry Stutzriem, Director of Research at Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And I want to pose this question right off the bat. Why can the closest partners and allies of the United States buy unmanned aerial vehicles more easily from the Chinese than they can from the United States? Well, today we'll explore that question, its implications, and much more as Mitchell Institute rolls out a seminal policy paper titled Modernizing Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Export Policy for Effective Coalition Forces. It was extensively researched and written by Mitchell's own Heather Penney. She is a resident fellow and conducts extensive research on defense policy with focus on the advantages and leveraging those advantages of aerospace power. She worked for over a decade in the defense industry, focused on defense budgets, supporting program execution and campaign management. She served in the Washington, D.C. Air National Guard and flew F-16s and G-100s, and she serves now as a member of the Air Force Reserve in the National Military Command Center. She continues to fly vintage aircraft, has raced jets, and has co-piloted vintage bombers with the Collings Foundation. Welcome to you, Heather. And additionally, we're ready for this paper. It's truly a wake-up call for change. We also have, and are honored to have with us today, Keith Webster. Warm welcome to you, Keith. Keith Webster is president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Defense and Aerospace Export Council. He's responsible for guiding the development of the Export Council to strengthen U.S. defense and aerospace exports. He's got over 30 years leading policy formulation and implementation, and he's an expert from both inside and outside the Department of Defense, having served there with distinction. He was Director of International Cooperation from 2012 to 2017, and touts expertise in foreign sales of military equipment and services, international agreements, and technology security foreign disclosures. Well, again, welcome, Keith and Heather. It's a pleasure to have you online with us today. I'd like to start today's session by having Heather give us a rundown on the project, and following Heather, I'd like to give you, Keith, some time to give us your perspective. If this works for you both, I'll ask Heather to kick us off. Over to you, Heather.
All right, very good. So I'd like to give a little bit of background on why we actually embarked on this research and study, because I've been really focusing a lot of my efforts on future warfare. And it became clear to us as we looked at these future operational concepts, the technologies and capabilities that we would need to be able to support this competition and global strategic competition against Russia, and specifically in China as well, that unmanned aerial vehicles, whether or not they were remotely piloted, manned-unmanned teaming, or fully autonomous, will be a critical element of this future force design and future force structure. But we began to realize that there are some significant barriers to being able to field these aircraft across the entire coalition. So what we wanted to do is provide a warfighter perspective to this research. So if we step back into Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine to 1987, you'll remember this is really the heart of the Cold War, right? Where everyone was concerned about the potential for massive nuclear warfare. A number of treaties were focused on limiting warheads and the proliferation of nuclear warheads and capabilities, but the Missile Technology Control Regime, which in 1987 came together, was focused not on the warheads themselves, but actually on the delivery technologies. So ballistic missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, vehicles that could deliver the warheads, nuclear initially, and then weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological. These were the focus of the Missile Technology Control Regime. The 35 partners came together not in a treaty, but in a gentleman's agreement. So this is wholly voluntary. There is no means for the Missile Technology Control Regime, which I'll begin calling the MTCR, no means for the MTCR to be able to enforce, inspect, or even punish any violations of the regime's agreements or its guidelines. But ultimately, because these technologies were deemed exquisite, they were very difficult to be able to develop, to innovate, to integrate, and then be able to employ. Being able to restrict the export of these technologies was one of the main reasons why they viewed this as a viable means of strengthening the efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear and WMD capabilities. In 1992, there was a realization that really the cruise missile element of it were actually very similar to what we largely recognize as drones. Now, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, have been in employment since the 1930s, but they've always been a very small, very niche kind of capability, and not very effective, if you will, when employed in combat. But because these technologies looked similar, the MTCR decided to include and incorporate unmanned aerial vehicles into the regime. So all of the partner nations came to a mutual concurrence, so 100% agreement to include unmanned aerial vehicles within the guidelines and the restrictions of the MTCR. Again, because these drone technologies were viewed as equivalent and similar to cruise missile technologies, and the concern was that they could potentially be used as a loophole to deliver WMD. But the challenge is these drone technologies, although they really had not been very effective, they had only been very niche in previous decades, and even during the 1980s, were almost wholly neglected in terms of developing and integrating into conventional military operations. In the 1990s and the noughts, we see significant developments in the technologies, specifically when we see the MQ-1, the Predator, really debut in the late 90s, which then of course leads to the Reaper. We've got the Global Hawk. And so we're seeing a very clear vector, a very trend line of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles. Not only are those technologies stepping up, but their capabilities are stepping up both aerodynamically in terms of range and payload, but in sensors. And as a result, they become important, essential elements of conventional military operations. Any warfighter who has been deployed in operations or conducted exercises understands that they are fully integrated into everything that we do. So with this vector, what's next? The future warfare work that we've been doing indicates that unmanned aerial vehicles, again, whether or not they're remotely piloted, manned-unmanned teaming, or fully autonomous, will be essential elements and fully integrated into everything that we do as a military. And that includes our coalition partners. We see here an artist schematic of Boeing's Loyal Wingman. What's important to note here is that these technologies will need to be commensurate with manned aircraft. So they'll need to have the range, the speed, the payloads, the capabilities commensurate with manned aircraft in order to be effective and really contribute within the future battle space. But the MTCR guidelines restrict the export of these critical technologies. UAV technologies, and this is just a limited excerpt from the MTCR annex. Some of the technologies that are covered by that annex and restricted from export to our key allies and partners include things like turbojets and turbofans, composite structures, gyros, INS, flight control equipment, antennas to receive satellite signals, and even stealth or reduced observable signals. This is important because as you look at this list, it's actually not very different from technologies that are incorporated on manned platforms that we are exporting to our allies and our partners. The F-35 is an excellent example of how we have approved these specific technologies for exports for our partners and our allies because we understand how essential and important it is that they have the same capabilities that we have so that we can operate in an integrated, effective manner and really fight as one team. But again, the MTCR restricts these technologies simply because there isn't a pilot in the cockpit. The MTCR furthermore divides whole systems into two primary categories. Category one, these larger, more capable vehicles are subject to the most restrictive types of controls, right? So any vehicle, whole vehicle that can go further than 300 kilometers and can carry more than 500 kilograms is subject to these stronger restrictions. And the MTCR calls it the really a strong presumption of denial. So it's a bias of the partner nations to start from no, not to start from yes. So the strong presumption of denial says that any UAV within this category 1, again, begins with no. And you'll note that all we would need to do is plunk a pilot in the cockpit, and then suddenly the entire export controls would wholly change. Category 2 UAVs are deemed less capable, right? So less than 300 kilometers, irregardless of the payload, these category 2 UAVs are not subject to the same onerous types of restrictions. But we need to keep in mind that regardless of how capable these smaller UAVs may be, the aerodynamic challenges of range, payload, maneuverability that are imposed by the tyranny of distance, whether or not that's in the Russian, the European theater, or specifically within the Pacific theater when we look at competing with China, that we know that we're going to need to have the capabilities of category 1 UAVs. So regardless of how capable those smaller UAVs may be because of improvements through Moore's law of swap and so forth, the category 1 aerodynamic attributes will be what we truly need for all of our partners to have to be effective contributors within the operation. It's important to note that the MTCR, they do meet, the regime meets every year, and they are looking at potentially revising the definitions of these categories and imposing an additional threshold of airspeed in order to be able to sort of keep up with the pace of technology, right? Because we know that unmanned aerial vehicles, we've already looked at some of the trend lines. So how would we accommodate some of that and perhaps drop some of these category 1 UAVs into the less restrictive category 2? The US proposed an 800 kilometer per hour airspeed, which was denied, so there did not reach 100% concurrence by the regime. And so now we have information that the US is potentially looking at adding an additional airspeed proposal, not from 800 kilometers per hour, but dropping that to 600 kilometers per hour, which is roughly about 320 knots. Which again, when you take a look at the demands of the future operational environment, 320 knots is not what we will need to be able to get these unmanned aerial vehicles to be effective loyal wingmen, conduct manned-on-manned teaming, or operate in prohibitive environments at the forward edge of the battle space. So still, this does not solve the problem set. It enables the look of advancement, the look of change, but really it doesn't move the ball forward in the way that the warfighter needs. It's important that we're able to share these UAV technologies, these capabilities, the platforms, and the whole systems, because they do strengthen both our partnerships from an international relations standpoint, but more important for the warfighter, the coalition operations, right? Clear signal of US commitment, especially in this uncertain and unstable world. It allows us to be able to have those bilateral relationships, but most importantly, we know that the US Air Force is smaller and older than it ever has been, and we will not go to war without our partners and our allies. So by ensuring that they have the most capable UAVs, that they share the same systems that we have, those allies can be that forward presence when we are either don't have the ability, when we're spread too thin, and they can conduct ISR, they can plug into our systems, we can do the same exploitation and in terms of intelligence and signals, and share that information much more seamlessly than we can if they don't have these capabilities. When we do go to combat, having that machine-to-machine data exchange is crucial to be able to seamlessly, instantaneously, and precisely share the information that we need to do to be able to close those kill chains. So it provides more seamless and more effective operations. Overall, it just provides much more effective integration of our allies and our partners across the entire spectrum of operations, and they ultimately enable our allies and our partners to be force multipliers. You'll note here in the photograph that we have here that we have been successful in exporting some limited numbers of UAVs to our closest partners and allies. That, unfortunately, is the exception, not the rule. The strong presumption of denial that the MTCR imposes really means that the rule is no. We start with no, and it's exceedingly difficult to be able to get to yes. So it really restricts the UAV exports we have to our allies and partners. The Jordanian Royal Air Force is a key case in point that we highlight within the research, because they came to the US multiple times understanding that they had an operational need for unmanned aerial vehicles, and they came to the US multiple times in order to be able to have access to the same technologies that we have and be able to conduct coalition operations. And every single time the US said no, to the point where we literally drove the Jordanians into the arms of the Chinese in order to be able to acquire these key technologies. But the Chinese equipment, like you see in the photograph there, it's a Jordanian CH-4, a cask-built, Chinese-built equivalent of an MQ-9. This kind of equipment poses more than just an interoperability problem, right? Because it's not just about the machine-to-machine interface. It really prohibits full integration of these partners because of their equipment across our operations, whether or not that's how they dial into the ATO, or how they share intelligence they gather, or how we share intelligence with them, right? Because Chinese equipment enables Chinese intelligence gathering and ultimately offers the potential for Chinese intrusion into our networks. That is the real risk of driving our allies and partners into the Chinese. It ultimately creates a massive liability to the US warfighter. You see a quote there from Republican Duncan Hunter: "Not only will a new market exist for China to export its technology, any incorporation of Chinese assets will directly harm US interoperability, and I would offer directly harm US operations." But we know that the MTCR has good intentions. By limiting the proliferation and access to these delivery technologies, the intention was to limit the potential for global nuclear destruction. The problem is that the world has moved on. There's a totally different technological context. And all we need to do is take a look at the commercial UAV market, which, by the way, the commercial UAV market is still subject to the Military Technology Control Regime guidelines and annex. These technologies are widely available. They're scalable. Once you develop the understanding, the controls, the mechanisms to be able to navigate, do the flight controls, it's actually not that much of a step to go from small to large, to go from category 2 to category 1. And the other thing too is that because the market is so vast, by restricting the export, what we're doing is we're actually creating an incentive for indigenous development, as well as creating that market opening for China and other competitors. What you see there on the bottom are two figures taken from the Teal Group, an excellent aviation analyst, and then the Danish Technological Institute looking specifically at UAV patents and innovation. And you can just simply see how not only are the number of units being produced every year continuing to grow, but also the innovation is continuing to grow as well in terms of the number of patents that are filed. So the MTCR has not been successful in retarding the development and the access and the proliferation of the technologies involved with the UAV. So despite good intentions, it's actually not working. And I would offer that the MTCR is actually having negative consequences which are counter to their intent and their implied mission. The MTCR guidelines ultimately, by restricting UAV exports amongst allies and partners, is distorting natural market forces. And therefore, this market distortion, it actually rewards irresponsible actors, because responsible actors, those who would monitor use, control end use, be able to work on the types of technologies that would be transferred in a responsible way, the way we normally do arms control exports. Because they're restricted through the MTCR, we're actually opening up a market for those global actors that don't care about any of those things. As a result, this global market not only is open to China to sell, but it's opened to their influence, because as we know, export isn't just about the widget, it's ultimately about the relationship, the integration, the long-term development and cultivation of a closeness, not just between militaries, but between nations. And furthermore, and this is also very disturbing, because the MTCR is restricting the US from exporting UAVs to our allies and to our partners, we're actually funding Chinese capability advancements. And you see that in the images there as well, from the CASC CH-4 to their equivalent of a Global Hawk to their equivalent of an advanced stealth, an autonomous UAV. But you don't just have to take it from me. You can look, the quote that we have there from Song Zhongping, a Chinese military analyst, saying that the United States restricting its arms exports is precisely what gives China a great opportunity. So continuing to adhere to and apply MTCR guidelines to UAVs facilitates Chinese strategic interests. It's working against US interests. So the recommendations that we propose within the study is, as I mentioned before, the US has been proposing airspeed amendments to redefine category 1 and 2 thresholds, but we just see this as simple window dressing. This does not truly address not only the pace of technology, but the real operational needs that the future battle space will require, that not only the US, but all of our partners in coalition will require. As I mentioned, the MTCR is not a treaty. It is a gentleman's agreement. It's a political agreement, and the regime is wholly voluntary. And furthermore, the guidelines, they recognize that national statutes and legislation trump, they take priority over any of the guidelines within the MTCR. So we believe that the US Congress should craft language in the 2021 NDAA that defines UAVs as aircraft, not cruise missiles, but as aircraft and subject to the same export considerations as any other military aircraft. We believe that this language as statute would be sufficient to be able to remove UAVs from being subject to the MTCR guidelines. Furthermore, as a waterfall consequence, the US should review any other policies that restrict the export of UAVs and adjust those policies accordingly, so that we don't have any conflict between the statute and the intent of the statute, which would be to export UAVs just like any other military aircraft. We need to ensure that any other policy also conforms to that intention. In addition to this, we believe that the NDA should direct that UAVs have the same co-development, co-production, and any other privilege afforded to manned military aircraft. And we think this is important because that co-production and co-development can be beneficial to everyone who is involved, especially when it comes to cost sharing and interoperability. This would open up the opportunity for the administration to re-engage strategic partners like Jordan that are interested in US UAVs and in cultivating a stronger strategic relationship, not just with the US military, but with us as a nation. And then finally, to be able to contribute to this, we believe that the NDA should also direct the Department of Defense to turn the conversation with our allies and partners to develop standing UAV requirements and configuration approvals for those allies and partners. Now, this is a conversation that typically takes place long after the letter of interest and request has been sent, but we also know that these negotiations and this dialogue takes a considerable amount of time and can actually create such a length of time that UAV and the configuration is no longer relevant or applicable to the operational needs in the strategic environment. So we believe that should be on the front end, and it should be lead turned, and it creates an excellent opportunity for us to positively engage again with our allies and partners. In the end, I would love for the takeaway to be that UAVs are aircraft. They are not cruise, they are not ballistic missiles, and it's long time that we begin treating them as aircraft. It will be essential to the way of the future.
Thank you very much, Heather. Hey, Keith, over to you for some comments.
Oh, excellent. First of all, Larry, Heather, and to the Mitchell Institute, it's an honor to be with you here this morning. This is a topic near and dear to me and my council and the chamber, and the report in the paper that's being published by Heather and the Institute is exceptional. And I really encourage the widest dissemination and to read it twice. It's chock full of good stuff. First of all, I'd like to say that, I understand Heather's given excellent overview of the evolution of MTCR and its purpose and its intent and its history. And I certainly respect the history of the MTCR and its evolution and the work of the member nations over the decades. And I understand why initially UAVs were included in the MTCR, but as Heather has done a great job reminding us, the times have moved on and we really need to take a hard look at the inclusion of UAS, UAV in MTCR. I think it's time for it to come out. I'd like to cover a few key points and reinforce what Heather has shared already. The denial opens the door for China. China is an adversary when it comes to many aspects of the relationship, most certainly militarily. And we should not be opening any doors militarily for China and its industry and its military and intelligence group to infiltrate the relationships we have with allies and partners, period. The Middle East is a prime example. Jordan is one that I was involved with personally and directly, very frustrated by that. But we also have Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of which came to us and said, look, we have a military capability that we need filled, and we want the US to fill this capability, and we'll work with you on how to fill that capability, as they have done, UAE F-16 Block 60, before we fielded that with our own Air Force. THAAD, I was involved in THAAD, and of course THAAD is defensive capability. The first international sale of THAAD, multi-billion-dollar sale, was the UAE. Most advanced defensive capability that we have. Yes, it's not offensive, it's defensive, but the point is, we have this trusted relationship that we have nurtured over decades, and now we are eroding that relationship with these decisions like China and the UAV capability. It complicates, as Heather pointed out, our mill-to-mill relationship. We have military personnel all over the place for a reason, and we have a long-standing, fruitful relationship mill-to-mill. And what we've now done is complicated that relationship by allowing Chinese military to infiltrate the bases and the relationship. And it not only does all the things that Heather pointed out, but it also has one other critical effect. And the Pentagon issued a statement on this last fall. And that is, it impacts adversely the ability of the United States to provide these partner nations future advanced military capability, because now we have an adversary military as an advisor and platforms on the tarmac. Case in point, UAE F-35. It's no secret that the UAE has asked years ago for F-35. And that's a tough decision for a number of reasons. But given F-16 Block 60 years ago, there's a potential to expect at some point we would say yes. But now we have complicated getting to a future yes, because now we have given the bureaucracy, and I was part of the bureaucracy, another point of considerable worry, and that is the relationship with China militarily because of this platform. So we've done this to ourselves. Some would argue, well, the Chinese capability is inferior. Well, yeah, today it's inferior to what we produce, but every year it's getting better. And I have no doubt that they will get much better, much more accurate. And this issue of taking comfort on the US side and denying this capability and saying, well, the Chinese capability is inferior, will be eroded as well. And there's difficulty turning back. Heather brings up the issue of cooperation. We are denied the ability to cooperatively develop next generation Cat 1, Category 1 UAS, UAV capability, even with the UK. With our closest, Five Eyes, with our closest allies, we are denied the ability to partner on next generation capability, which to me is absolutely mind-boggling. Our Five Eye allies, many of them, are part of our F-35 development program, have been for 2 decades. The most advanced fighter aircraft. I don't need to tell you more, but it's just mind-boggling that we can't engage in a cooperative R&D relationship with the UK and others, even in the Five Eyes, let alone anyone outside of the Five Eyes as allies or key partners. We know from defense innovation studies over the past decade that moving forward to rapidly develop advanced capability and a whole host of ranges of kit is that we need to partner more so than ever with our allies and friends, both in the defense technology sector but also in the commercial sector. And we can't even move forward with a trusted ally on cooperative R&D. That's a problem that needs to be fixed. The second issue is tech control and influence. I can't go into the details, but we have proven with our industries, with our defense industries, that we know how to build equipment, we know how to secure the equipment from reverse engineering, from tampering, and we work with our partners on doing so. Some of that is highly classified, but we do it. We have a proven history of doing this. And so I do not accept the argument that we somehow cannot do so on Cat 1 and Cat 2 UAS platforms today and going forward tomorrow. I just don't buy it. I think there is a systemic resistance, and we'll come into that in just a minute. With these systems, if we're transferring them, we train side by side, we shape their military doctrine, we shape how they utilize them on the battlefield, and we intervene politically and militarily, general at your level and above, to discuss about our concerns, and have been historically incredibly successful in redirecting behavior. We cannot do that if the Chinese are providing the system. All right, not much more to say on that. As I said, in the aviation platforms, F-35, advanced F-18, next generation F-16, I mentioned Block 60 from years ago. We have a proven process for the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, some of which is nuclear capable. We have a proven process of adjudicating within the interagency and with the Congress a sale or no sale. And in the case of a sale, how to configure that sale. Not every sale is exactly like, not every configuration is identical. We have ways to manage all of that to make it a win-win for the United States military and its warfighting allies and partners. There's no different, should be no different for UAV platforms, and that is the point that you're making. Moving forward, we will never reach consensus within the MTCR regime because, for example, the Russians are not incentivized to agree with anything that we say right now, and they're not alone. I respect the administration's hard work on this. I wish we would act unilaterally. We have the ability to act unilaterally. And I would like to see us do so very soon. I had great hope that this administration, with its bold unilateral actions on so many fronts, would take unilateral action with this regime on UAV, not on pulling out of MTCR. Stay into the MTCR, it has served its purpose, but act unilaterally on UAS, UAV, Cat 1 especially, the whole thing, pull it out. We must, we have this proven process for fighter aircraft, and I agree with your assessment, and we've published this to the administration multiple times, that our desire is your desire, and that is to have these platforms treated as aircraft and let the proven interagency process with the Congress prevail in deciding go, no go. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, thanks, Keith. That was rich insight. Really appreciate the inputs. I'd like to move to some questions, and let me back up for a second. Heather brought up Jordan. I'll just say anecdotally, I went in 2015 to Jordan with a group of generals and admirals, and we talked to the top military leadership. Most of us did not understand what the Jordanians were going through to try to get Predator at that time. And they pled with us, trying to lay out their security concerns, how much they wanted to buy a US product, but denied. And they also laid out that they have to put first their security concerns. Our conversations after that within that group of senior leaders was very, very vigorous. I'm wondering, you've had exposure at the highest levels of a country like Jordan. Do they make this case forcefully? Is this a common occurrence among our partners and allies?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Jordan, I was in some of the highest level meetings where this was discussed. And from a Jordanian perspective, I mean, there was one discussion where they very politely but very directly said that if the US ambassador continues to remove this from our request to the US government, we will be forced to go to China. And I had never, in my political, military, high-level discussions, witnessed such an honest statement from a foreign government at that level, at a very, very senior level. Again, foreign military sales and direct commercial sales are governed by State Department legislation. So the Arms Export Control Act and the Foreign Assistance Act, if it's US State Department funded like Egypt or Israel. So the State Department, foreign administration, is the decision body of a go, no go. And if it's a go, then it's turned over, it's notified to the Congress. So the non-proliferation aspects of our foreign policy reside within the State Department. And I believe it's the non-proliferation community as advisors to the Secretary of State and to the ambassadors around, our ambassadors around the world, that often weighs in to reinforce the commitments under the MTCR. So in the case of Jordan and a few other countries, there's often the request doesn't even get out of the US Embassy to the interagency and to the Department of Defense and to the US Air Force or the Navy to begin to adjudicate, to overcome a presumption of denial. It gets stopped right there. And it's often for non-proliferation purposes.
Very good. You were deeply involved, by the way, and just referred to the difference between the process involving unmanned and F-35s, and you had worked on the F-35 program, as you said. Can you describe a little more how those processes are different for the nations who are seeking to buy unmanned aircraft, and how that might change if, as Heather suggests, we define as a nation, as a statute, that these UAVs are like any other combat aircraft?
Yeah, so the fundamental difference is the missile technology control regime and the issue, the commitment, the voluntary commitment within that regime amongst its members of a presumption of denial. So when you have a nation who has submitted a letter of request seeking F-35, there is not a presumption of denial to overcome. It allows not having that presumption of denial for aviation aircraft, fighter aircraft, or other aircraft, allows you to have a conversation in a way that can be productive and fruitful, beginning with, okay, what is the intended purpose? Does providing an F-35 to this particular nation create an escalating aspect regionally? Does it have a potential of disrupting, balance of power in the region, which would be detrimental to our goals? But you have these conversations. It's not an automatic presumption of denial that you have to overcome, which is very difficult. The door is open for a conversation. You may not get to a yes. You may, like UAE, be told, let's keep that discussion ongoing. They have not been denied, has not been rejected. It is a conversation that continues. Interesting.
And Keith, your perspective also very similar to what the warfighter leadership would see. You've described that as, as Heather termed it, deleterious effects of this policy. Can you elaborate just a short piece on how you've seen this impact the mill-to-mill relationships and the potential for coalition operations?
Right. So there is a multiplying effect for our forces on the ground if we have the ability to utilize capability such as UAS, UAV surveillance capability with partners and allies in the region. With a Chinese platform, as Heather pointed out, there is no way we would ever electronically interoperate with that platform. The risk is too high, that we would inadvertently reveal source codes of our systems, etc. So right there, you've lost the force multiplier. And what that means for US forces is if they need to multiply their capability in the battlefield, we now have to provide it to them, to our forces. We have to provide them greater kit, more UAVs, which is costly to our defense budget. Why not harness appropriately, as we have historically, the capability, the interoperable capability of our friends and allies in any conflict or surveillance mode? That, to me, is the biggest compounding effect.
Very insightful. Hey, Heather, I want to step back. You said something. Like to clarify. Of course, MTCR being about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons capabilities, and somehow we arrived at equating UAVs with essentially nuclear ballistic missiles. But there were changes in the regime that affected export policy, or change in policy that affected exports in both 2015 and 2018. Can you describe those changes for us in a little more detail?
Absolutely. So in 2015, the Obama administration actually opened up UAV exports to armed UAVs as well. And this in many ways was a response to the need for our allies to be able to access the persistence, the precision, and then have that rapid kill chain. At the same time that this occurred, they also, however, imposed greater restrictions and controls on those nations that would be requesting armed UAVs. And so in net effect, they essentially canceled these changes to the policy, canceled each other out. In 2018, we saw an additional change of the Trump administration to then begin to look at how to really, in many ways, the intent was to open up the ability to export by essentially increasing trade opportunities for U.S. companies, bolstering the partner security and counterterrorism capabilities, and strengthening these bilateral relationships. So the intention behind the 2018 policy was there, as well as to accelerate the sales of UAVs. The challenge was in terms of the bureaucratic process, and importantly, the strong presumption of denial and the adherence to the MTCR guidelines and the previous controls. None of that was changed. So while the intent to open up UAV exports to our allies and partners is there, none of the bureaucratic processes necessary to facilitate that followed. And that's one of the concerns that we have right now, is we understand that the State Department, the administration, and the National Security Council are engaging in conversations about the future policy of UAV export, especially with respect to the MTCR. We understand those conversations are ongoing. Our concern is that, like these previous policy changes, that the net effect will be zero, that the strong presumption of denial will continue to remain in place, and that the administration will continue to define UAVs as cruise missiles, as ballistic missiles for the purposes of export controls, and that will essentially continue to close the door to our partners and to our allies. And because we understand that unmanned aerial vehicles are absolutely essential to future warfare, what we'll need to be able to do in the battle space, to the manned-to-manned teaming, to be able to sense across an autonomous fabric within the battle space, everything that we imagine for what these future operational concepts will be depends upon having a robust UAV structure in place. And that means our partners and coalition allies. An additional thing is that as we look at the probability of decreased defense budget, almost certainty of decreased defense budgets, this co-development and co-production will be another important piece to ensuring the security of all of, not just the United States, but of all our partners and allies as well. And this prohibits that kind of development. So while I understand that there are conversations, discussions going on right now, our primary concern is that, like the past, this will just simply be window dressing. A lot of publicity, but in a sense, essentially no change. And
well,
this isn't.
Excuse me, Heather.
I just want to say, this isn't to say that the individuals at the State Department in the non-proliferation, they're good Americans. They truly are trying to do what is right for our nation and right for the security of our nation, and to prevent nuclear war and the deployment of weapons of mass destruction. I think what they fail to understand is that the global context has changed, the technological context has changed, and that continuing to adhere to these MTCR guidelines and the internal policies that support those non-proliferation guidelines with respect to UAVs actually increases the proliferation of these technologies and increases the opportunities for irresponsible actors.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of good intentions, but not necessarily good effect. Keith, just curious, those changes in 2015, 2018, those sorts of changes, along with proposed airspeed changes that Heather briefed us on, do you see, had they materially affected any export decisions when they were placed in place? Or do you see these future proposed changes having much effect?
Right. So there has been a little bit of change. So I do want to give State Department some credit and the administration. Right from the get-go with this administration, within 3 months, they approved the Category 1 Sea Guardian sale to India, which was something I had worked on with Ash Carter, and we were blocked by the interagency. So the US government in that instance exercised its authority, as any member under the regime has, to unilaterally make a decision for its own security and foreign policy reasons. So the administration, within 3 months of taking office, approved the Sea Guardian sale to India, which is a Cat 1 capability. So that was encouraging. For the policy changes, it has been disappointing, but there have been a few changes. One, in April 2018, they announced that they intended to approve more Category 1 and Category 2 sales via DCS, as opposed to foreign military sales, direct commercial sales. They have done that. They have approved, I believe, 2 sales to be conducted with a predominance of direct commercial sales activity, with a small component would be government controlled under foreign military sales. So that's encouraging. Where we intervened was reminding the administration and pointing out for the White House that there was a resistance within the services to actually comply with the direct commercial sale policy change. And for their own reasons, again, as Heather pointed out, these are all great Americans, they're all trying to do the right thing. But for significant change like this, it takes really political or congressional leadership to provide the top cover that the bureaucracy needs to move forward. The proposed changes within the MTCR context of speed is a Band-Aid. I mean, that buys us a year or two, but we're right back to square one because we haven't resolved the issue. It would enable some additional sales to go forward within the context of MTCR, because Cat 1 systems as categorized today would then be considered Category 2. But let's be honest, we're witnessing products from other nations that are being categorized as Category 2, but with a turn of a wrench, all of a sudden you've got the speed in your Cat 1. So, okay, it's a Cat 2 today, and then with a minor adjustment on the tarmac, you're right up to Cat 1. So we really need to be bold and move forward as you suggest.
Outstanding. Well, we've come to the end of this discussion. Thank you, Keith and Heather. Tremendous insights. Heather, we'll be watching to see if your recommendations lead to better prospects for coalition forces. For our audience, you can download a copy of the policy paper on our website at mitchellaerospacepower.org. And as an alert, our next research event will be on June 18th, when Mitchell Institute will roll out a research benchmark for the long-range strike debate The title of the study is Long Range Strike, Resetting the Balance of Stand-in and Standoff Forces. It's written by Mitchell's own Mark Gunzinger. He's our Director of Future Concepts and Capabilities Assessments. Okay, Heather and Keith, we're going to move into questions. Are you guys ready to go? Very good. We're now going to open our session to questions from the audiences who have been listening to our conversation. Feel free to direct your question to one or both of our guests today. As a reminder to our listeners, you can participate in the Q&A by using the raise hand function on the application. When I call you, please unmute your mic, state your name and affiliation, and our guest that you're directing your question at as you ask your question with that. First, let's go to Valerie Insignia.
Hi there. Thank you guys for doing this. I was wondering, you know, if, I guess like this is a two-part question. What's the latest that you guys have been hearing about making airspeed changes to the MTCR? I feel like it sort of comes up every now and then, but haven't really been able to track how seriously that's been being taken. And I'm wondering also if those changes were to go into effect, in your mind, are there any additional sort of arms control restrictions that might be necessary to just sort of balance out to ensure that these weapons don't fall into the wrong hands, or is the existing structure sufficient for ensuring that?
So Valerie, from my perspective, what I understand is the United States proposed an 800 kilometer per hour airspeed as an additional definition for Category 1, and that was rejected because it did not reach complete consensus amongst the regime partners. I understand that they will attempt to repropose a reduced airspeed threshold of 600 kilometers per hour. But again, as I mentioned, this really equates to roughly, depending on altitudes and temperatures, about 300 to 320 knots, which is not a tactical airspeed, right? So, so in terms of future operational concepts and how we would employ within the battle space, this is insufficient to be able to support these future technologies and the types of manned-unmanned teaming concepts that we have going forward. Break to talk to your second question of what additional controls need to be placed upon that. I would offer that that's perhaps the wrong perspective. When you look at the standard controls that we have when we consider any manned aircraft, we believe that that dialogue, those evaluations, those controls are sufficient to be able to not only promote the interests of our allies and partners, but importantly promote the interests and protect the interests of the United States as well. And that's really what we need to be shifting to, is moving away from the limitations of the MTCR and shifting into treating these UAVs as if they are aircraft, because that's really and truly what they are. And that will give us the positive controls in order to ensure that our allies have the necessary and appropriate capabilities and technologies, and also to ensure that we have that we're able to have those effective operations. The challenge is that when we refuse to step into that space and we just say no, no, no because of the MTCR presumption of denial, that's when you open up the market to those irresponsible actors that you referred to.
Okay, we'll go to our next question. We've got Rob Smith.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I had a question with this restrictions of UAS exports. As we're developing future warfighting concepts, specifically as it relates to the JADC2 effort, how do you see these restrictions limiting our ability, especially as we look at joint concepts and even allied and partners? Thank you.
Probably send that to Heather.
It's almost like I wrote the question myself. Promise I didn't. So this is actually a very important problem set, right? Because some of the technologies that are restricted and controlled by the MTCR are the antenna and communications equipment with satellites. And we know that satellites in low Earth orbit will be an essential element of how we're able to network together the entire battle space. So we know that these unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, will be an essential element of the Advanced Battle Management System, of JADC2, of facilitating these communications, of doing the sensing work that needs to be done. None of this currently is enabled, especially when think about the requirement to be able to push these platforms to the forward edge of the battle space, which demands Cat 1 capabilities. None of this is enabled by the MTCR guidelines right now. So if we continue to adhere to the MTCR guidelines, only the US will have our widgets. And to the extent that our partners are able to fund, develop, and field their own elements, they will be able to put those forward. But because, again, they are restricted by the MTCR as well from trading and exporting those capabilities, we will have to do additional work and middleware to be able to integrate all those heterogeneous capabilities. There will be diversity in the future battle space, and that's an essential element of resilience, but to the extent that we can't share, we can't integrate.
Yeah, Heather, I think about coalition operations back in 2001, 2002. As you know, Dave Deptula, the Dean of Mitchell, and I were in the pioneering group of the use of UAVs. And we gathered the coalition partners behind a chain link fence in a parking lot at CENTCOM because of security concerns. And how far we've come from that, your comments are very salient in that in the future, we cannot afford to not have them integrated and interoperable with us. We've got a question from Peter Hickman.
Hi, I think my question is to Heather, and it has to do with the recommendation to recategorize UAS as aircraft. So as was mentioned in your discussion, that parts of the MTCR have been really valuable, I think specifically with regard to missiles and non-proliferation, and so there's parts of it that we care about. How would you address concerns that as a voluntary international agreement, if the United States unilaterally, effectively line item vetoes UASs and we begin considering them differently, how do you address concerns that fundamentally undermines the MTCR as a whole? Because what's then to stop other signatories from doing the same thing on whatever systems they would like to proliferate? Thanks.
So one of the ways that they need to approach removing unilaterally UAS from the definition there is to, at the same time, affirm our commitment to the non-proliferation and the control of the technologies associated with cruise missiles, and specifically with the ballistic missiles. So we know that those technologies still are generally exquisite enough that they're very difficult for nations to indigenously develop, although we've seen advancements within Iran, we've seen advancements within North Korea, but it has essentially slowed their development down as well. And so we do understand that the UAV, the global technological context of those capabilities has shifted, it's fundamentally changed, and that's why the MTCR is actually working counter to the intent and the interests of the non-proliferation community. And that also needs to be very clearly communicated. Our partners are, when I say partners within the regime, the global community needs to understand that we're making this change not because we don't care about non-proliferation, not because we're not committed to non-proliferation, but because we are. And only by stepping into that market vacuum can we provide the appropriate leadership and controls in a responsible manner from the very beginning of defining configurations to end use and everything that happens in between. That's the only way that we can really pursue the interests of non-proliferation.
Keith, I wonder if you've got a comment on that.
Yeah, so Peter has raised the very fundamental issue that is what is the issue of anxiety with the non-proliferation community. I mean, that question, that issue is it in a nutshell. And the concern about just the complete unraveling of the regime and what it stands for is sufficient enough at the moment to paralyze innovative thinking here. And I think it's a legitimate question, and Heather's done a great job of answering it. And in the end, we need to do two things. One, there are challenges with compliance within the regime already, with at least one member. So, we have to be honest with ourselves. And secondly, we have to look for creative ways to address the issues that concern us, as Heather mentioned. But we also must be honest with ourselves about the implications today. Again, I respect what happened in 1987 and 1995, et cetera. But we're talking about today, and we're talking about tomorrow. And what are the negative implications for continuing to keep this capability within the regime to our national security interests, our mil-to-mil relations, and our objectives globally? And we really need to be honest with ourselves about that. And I think that's why it's time for change.
Wow. Well, we've come to the end of this Mitchell Institute rollout of modernizing unmanned aerial vehicle export policy for effective coalition forces. Heather, great job. And Keith, thank you so much for that rich insight. We hope we can have you back sometime in the future. Thanks. To you and to our audience, from all of us at Mitchell Institute, we wish you a great aerospace powered day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.